Well, earlier on today, the Business and Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds spoke to GB News, and this is what he had to say.
Well, you've seen an incredibly swift and publicly visible response from the new government to the disorder that we have seen. I think that is important and I think it is necessary. Yes, there is sufficient capacity in the prison system because of decisions that were made in the early days of the new government. We have seen, I think, 780 arrests, 350 people charged already, and there will be more to come, and it will be the case that people will face the full force of the law. I think it's important that the public see not just a judicial system that's working well, but effective public services again in Britain.
Can you guarantee that rioters won't be released early under the overcrowding release scheme?
Now, I understand that they won't be, but because of those difficult decisions that were made by new ministers in the new government to make sure there is sufficient capacity moving on from the disastrous state that we inherited, it's because of those decisions there is capacity in the system to deal with this disorder.
What's been the extent of the impact on small businesses? Is there any estimate on the total cost of the disorder for businesses and police, courts, etc.?
No, it's very significant. I've been, for instance, in Liverpool on Friday talking to a small business owner affected. You'll understand that because of the position they're in, even getting back open has been a burden for them, and therefore we're probably not in a position at this stage to be able to assess the scale of the loss. We want to make sure the recovery is as swift and effective as the response has been. So that is, first of all, working with the Association of British Insurers to make sure claims are paid promptly. And then where businesses are underinsured or they're not insured, making sure they're aware there is still potentially support available to them under the terms of the Right Compensation Act. A lot of people not aware of that, but making sure, first of all, the small businesses are getting the support that they need, but also that the message goes out that if the public care about these businesses, recognise, as I do, they're at the heart of local communities, public need to get out there and support them, and that's my message to them as well today. If you care about these brilliant local businesses that are at the heart of your community, please give them your support in the days and weeks ahead.
That was Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary there. John Redwood, what do you make of the government's handling of these riots and Keir Starmer obviously trying to be tough on law and order, but not having really addressed some of the causes for this unrest?
Well, I think the government was right to see that this was wicked criminal damage and that there needed to be a strong response. And I understand why they didn't want to muddle that with other issues. But obviously, going forward, assuming they're now on top of this, we need to go back to a rational conversation about how you have growth in the economy, how you have more settled communities and so forth.
Do you think it's been largely about immigration, or are there other cost of living factors in consideration here? Is it that some white working class people, particularly in northern towns, feel left behind, do you think?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know these people who've been committing these offences, and they are criminals, and the government's right to treat them as criminals. There's no excuse for throwing things at shops or looting or whatever. But if we want to have a conversation about what do you do to have a proper growth strategy, I think that would be a very important part of the answer to the more general economic and political problems we face. And we were just hearing from the Business Secretary there saying, well, there's some help for small businesses that have been at the centre of this storm and are particularly damaged, but the whole small business community needs a lift.
Yes.
How do you get growth? How do you get better paid jobs? How do you get better service to the local community? You need a bigger population of self-employed and small businesses. We've had a big reduction in self-employed in recent years because of the tax changes and because of the COVID closures and lockdowns. And I think we need to grow the self-employed sector again. I think that requires favourable tax change. And I think the small businesses are restrained by the VAT threshold being too low. And so they get to a certain point and they don't grow any further. And we need to deal with that. And I don't see that from this government. And we hear the Business Secretary just talking about defensive things. I want him to be optimistic about self-employed and small business, and he's not being that.
James, I mean, if it turns out that some of these rioters that have been swiftly dealt with end up being released early under Labour's own early prisoner release scheme, it'll be a bit of an embarrassment politically, won't it?
It will be there. I mean, I noticed, of course, that when he was asked the question, the Business Secretary very quickly changed tack and moved elsewhere. So I think we need to see some more detail about that in the coming weeks or so, particularly when Parliament comes back. I suspect that it will be that they won't get released early, because I think there'll be some political pressure and such in the system to ensure that won't happen. But I was struck by that. I was also struck by the line about, the fact they don't have a figure yet for how much this is going to cost the state, which will be really interesting. There's a story today in The Independent which shows that I think the government is now facing £47 billion in historic costs to do with things like tainted blood, for instance. So you can imagine all these different things,
Yes.
all these pressures. I suspect these riots will cost a couple of billion added onto the bill, and that means all the millions that get spent on this don't get spent on, for instance, tax changes, things like small business relief, etc. So I think that's going to be something to watch out for in the coming months or so.
The other thing we heard of just in the news bulletin before by Sophia was this idea that Bridget Phillipson has introduced into the national curriculum some sort of lesson for children on discerning between real news and fake news. And we're both journalists in the right-wing media. You're at The Spectator, I'm here in at The Telegraph. I mean, obviously, the importance of proper journalism trumping sort of this sort of amateur reportage that seems to publish with impunity, doesn't have any sort of credence, shares information and misinformation too quickly, no legal checks or balances. Is this a good thing, do you think, for schools?
No, I don't think so, because I think that the thing is actually Labour have got this all mixed up, which is actually you need critical thinking, and therefore you produce the right outcomes. Having people who are independent thinkers, able to kind of analyse what they're being told, talk about the provenance, that's the way to approach this. I think they've got this the wrong way around, which is they want to come to it, they want to have these model people, but it's actually only the thinking through and the kind of interrogation of sourcing is what actually produces this. And my concern is the teachers, of course, who've now got to teach the academic curriculum, as well as things like sexual harassment, Andrew Tate lessons, for instance. We've had discussion. It's great to prescribe all these things, but I worry for the teachers on the ground who are going to have to teach all these things through.
Really quick word on that, John?
Well, I think good teaching of critical factors is absolutely crucial, but what I'm worried about is the idea they might want to legislate against so-called fake news, and one person's fake news is another person's belief. And governments are pretty good at sending out fake news, and they might fall foul of their own law if they're particularly clumsy. Surely the best thing is good, honest, democratic debate so that we can challenge each other where we disagree, and transparency by the public authorities so they publish accurate data, and we can then all get on with interpreting it. What I don't want is a single official agreed line on everything, and everybody who deviates is then some kind of rogue.
Yeah, if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong.
No, that would be a dreadful
That's not
outcome.
the approach we want necessarily in our education system. James Heal, John Redwood, thanks so much for joining me this morning. It's lovely to speak to you both.
Thank you.